Welcome to With One Accord, the Houston Chamber Choir podcast. I'm Flynn, host of Behind the Music. Today's episode is made possible in part by the generous support of Silvercrest Asset Management Group, providing an unparalleled level of quality investment advice. It's my great pleasure to welcome the British Consul General, Richard Hyde, to Behind the Music. Richard, thank you very much for being here. I know that this has been a very crazy time for all of us, but particularly for those in Britain and in the British diplomatic service. So thank you for making the time in the wake of the passing of Queen Elizabeth II.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. It has been a I'd say a challenging time because it's balancing the celebration of an amazing life with the passing of a fixture in our lives. It's been an interesting time, and overseas in sort of diplomatic circles, we've been inundated with messages of condolence and sadness from across the region I cover. So yeah, it's an uplifting, if challenging time.
Watching Her Majesty's funeral at Westminster Abbey, I was reminded that we were going to do this because one of the pieces that was sung was Vaughan Williams' setting of Taste and See, which, if I remember correctly, he wrote for, was it the Queen's coronation? Was it for her wedding?
It was a coronation. Yeah, it was one of his. I think he did a couple of. He composed that for the coronation, and I think he arranged something else for the coronation as well. But yeah, so interestingly, but two of his pieces at the coronation and two of his pieces at the funeral. So it's yeah. When I was watching it as well, and I saw the order of music, I thought, I will definitely make a point of reference in that when I speak.
Because we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of Vaughan Williams' birth, and he is one of the giants, certainly of British 20th century music. What is your relationship to Vaughan Williams?
So it all goes back to I'm a kind of an amateur historian. I am fascinated by the history of the Tudor court. So from the Wars of the Roses through to the Stuarts, that sort of 15th, 16th century history is something that I've always studied. I read books about it endlessly. I bore my children senselessly with it, and that is, for me, I was also intrigued at school. We studied Tallis and Bird, the great choral composers of the Tudor court, and so I've always been fascinated by that. And Vaughan Williams was also really influenced by that period as well. Now, obviously, his output and my outputs are quite different, but the same influences, the same fascination with traditional British English court choral music was something that at school. I went to a church run school with a very strong music tradition, and there was always a focus on those old choral pieces. And we studied, I think it was a GCSE or O level when I was 16. I think it was, we studied Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis, which of course is possibly his most famous piece, but it's still a piece that if I listen to it today, it stops me, and I have to kind of, it could be music in an elevator, I don't know, but I hear it and I stop and I think, and I remember it sort of takes me back to my youth and studying this music, and I think it's I think the Fantasia on the theme on Greensleeves as well, which is another piece where, of course, I think historians agree Greensleeves was not written by Henry VIII, but the point is that that's that period of music again shining through in his work. And so for me, it kind of resonates both of what I studied at school of him and the other musicians I studied at school that influenced him. So it's an interesting connection that I have with him.
One of the things that I think is so fascinating about Vaughan Williams is that he's very much within the sort of English choral tradition, going all the way back to people like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. But he also brought in new elements. I mean, he was instrumental in sort of unleashing British music from that sort of 19th century Germanic tradition, you know, Wagner and Brahms, etc., and forged a new way forward. And he really has held up, his reputation has held up as being quite an iconoclast in that sense.
Absolutely. I think the other thing about him is the influences he had, but also the contemporaries he worked with. And you know, I mean, famously, obviously, he studied under Ravel, but I'm not entirely sure anyone really knows what he studied under Ravel. It all seems to be a bit mysterious. But clearly, Hubert Parry was a huge influence on him.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And Parry was another great a musician of the generation before him, but also traced his influences back to that traditional English music. And I think his great friend was Gustav Holst, who, yes, again, another kind of mighty English composer of the first half of the 20th century, who, you know, is like Vaughan Williams, was able to kind of demonstrate that English music was a credible global force. And, you know, the Planet Suite, which everybody knows, the Planet Suite, doesn't matter how interested you are in music, you will have heard at least an element of it at some point, possibly in a Hollywood movie. But the point is that these were great composers who were all operating at the same time, and I believe they were sort of victims of their time as well, because, you know, I found whenever I read, I don't think I knew this when I studied him at school, but I didn't realize that Vaughan Williams, he volunteered for the First World War.
Yes.
At the age of 42 in 1914, which, you know, right now 42 feels an old age to be volunteering for the most gruesome war of the 20th century. But back in the day, that was quite an old age to be going to the front lines. He was an ambulance driver, and then later I think he was an artillery officer, which, if I remember correctly, damaged his hearing. So he, like many other great composers and writers and poets of that British early 20th century kind of group, they were all massively influenced by their experiences of trench warfare, of carnage, of brutality, of all that the First World War stood for, of losing all your friends. You know, many friends and contemporaries died in that war as well. And so I'm always fascinated by their ability to kind of capture those experiences and then create wonderful, uplifting music and poetry and books on the back of that. And I think particularly for him, because of the age he was at when he was on the front lines, I think, you know, his later years' music, I think, reflected on that.
You mentioned Hubert Parry, who was represented during Her Majesty's funeral earlier this week. One of the other great influences on Vaughan Williams, of course, was Charles Villiers Stanford. And you don't get through many Anglican services without hearing music by Parry or by Stanford, or nowadays also by Vaughan Williams. It's amazing to me that there is such an identifiable line or tradition that runs through British choral music that is tied to the University of Cambridge. So many of the great choral composers came out of Cambridge, and then through their compositions, we get them tied into the Three Choirs Festival every year, and there is just this line. No matter how new you might be and how innovative you might be, there is a line that ties you to the tradition, isn't there?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, Vaughan Williams, interestingly, I think when I read of him originally, I may be wrong here, but I seem to recall that he was only a Cambridge man because he was not so successful at the Royal College of Music. I think he moved on, and I think he later went back to Royal College of Music. So I think he was Cambridge by accident. But I think your point still stands that many of the greats Cambridge was part of that education piece. But I know my music teacher at school was a Royal College of Music man, and I'm sure he explained at great length that that he moved on to Cambridge because he didn't quite cut the mustard, and it's only when he matured and came back he was accepted back into the Confederacy of the Royal College of Music. But he may have been a little biased.
One of the remarkable things I think about Vaughan Williams is that he's known so much for his choral work, and yet the one aspect of his music that never really seemed to take off were his operas.
Yes, I think there's a. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that is quite a typical view of British operatic work generally. I don't think we're British operatic composers are given the due, their due worth. I mean, there are exceptions to that, but I have to confess I've never actually been to a Vaughan Williams opera, which possibly is because either not very good or are not often performed. But so I have to confess ignorance of his opera, of the capability of him as an opera composer. But he's certainly not. He's never in the list of great composers when it comes to opera.
It's funny because, of course, Benjamin Britten is the great English 20th century operatic composer, and people say that really there was nobody before Britten, and you have to go all the way back to Henry Purcell to the heady days of British opera. But Vaughan Williams has never made it into the sort of the standard repertoire, has he?
No, not at all. I think he. I mean, I've always seen him. Always understood him to be purely an orchestral composer who has these wonderful individual pieces that sort of stand out. And I think he also was he was at that kind of crossroads into kind of popularization of music, where you had film and TV scores and things like that, where he was able to kind of work to a slightly different audience as well. So he has a kind of broad repertoire as well, and I think he's probably better known by many people than they would imagine, because his work is so familiar, but you don't necessarily put a name to it. Because if you're going to if you go into a concert, you know who you're going to see. But if you listen to a movie, if you're watching a movie or listen to the radio, you don't necessarily know who's playing. And so I think his music is much more familiar. Certainly in my office when we were talking, when the forthcoming concert was first mentioned, it was interesting how few people knew who Vaughan Williams, and particularly when I pronounced it as Ralph Vaughan Williams, they were sort of looking at me askance, and I had to explain it was it's Ralph but pronounced differently. Right. But actually, once I start playing pieces on my laptop, people say, "Oh yeah, okay, I know that." So there is a wider familiarity in his work from the non-specialist music folk.
When I was in school, we used to have school assembly every Monday and Friday, and one of the masters, one of the math masters, actually was an organist, and there was an organ in the school assembly hall, and so he would always play the hymns, and looking at the hymnal, there were so many of those hymns that were arranged by, in some way, shape, or form, by Vaughan Williams, and he really sort of inserted himself into that English hymn tradition, didn't he, through his work on the English hymnal?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's family life. He's born in the Cotswolds, one of the most beautiful parts of England. So he had all this kind of wonderful kind of upper middle class upbringing. Son of I think he was an Anglican vicar, his father. So he had a very religious background. But I don't think he was ever a particularly religious person. I think he was an agnostic or an atheist much of his life. But despite that, he was inspired by the words of the Bible. So he was inspired by religious verse and prayer. And I think I think that the beauty of the word as opposed to the meaning of the word was his inspiration. And I think there's a great quote because, interestingly, he's from a family of famous people. You know, I think his mother's family were the Wedgwoods of pottery fame.
Yes.
And I think his great uncle was Charles Darwin. So
That's right.
You look at a sort of 19th century, non-religious figures. Charles Darwin is right up there.
Right up there.
And I think that I actually wrote down this the famous quote but somebody asked him about how do you reconcile your work in church music and in prayer with the kind of the heresy of your great uncle's work on and he says, the Bible says that God made the world in 6 days. Great Uncle Charles thinks it took a lot longer, but we need not worry about it, for it's equally wonderful either way. Yeah. So this is a really clever diplomatic answer to a question that I may get asked occasionally here in Texas. So it's I just think that to be inspired, and I think listening to some of the readings at the funeral this week of Her Majesty, the beauty of the words is really clear, and the way they're then arranged into orchestral pieces for the Psalms are just magnificent. And whatever your religion, you can appreciate that. So I think that's what I take from Vaughan Williams, is that he was inspired by religious works, but not necessarily by religion, which is an interesting place to be.
Of course, one of the marks of a great composer is seeing the musical possibilities in a text, and certainly that is something that that you cannot fault him on. He may not have been a hard and fast Anglican, but he saw the possibilities in those biblical texts.
Well, and of course, it's great. I mean, we talked before, is one of his great inspirations is Hubert Parry, who is a master at that very thing. I mean, Jerusalem, probably the most played hymn in England at any one time. He scored that to the great William Blake poem. So his mentor is somebody who has seen the beauty of words and turned them into music in church. It's and if you think about the traditions, I mean, I studied Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti at school as well, and they were so influenced in their day by the need to provide music to church settings, right. And obviously, Bach with his amazing, phenomenal organ pieces, and so that kind of culture of church driving innovation in music, irrespective of your religious beliefs it is a driving force, and I think that was definitely the case with Vaughan Williams.
Richard, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's sort of things have sort of come full circle this week with the funeral of Her Majesty, and the music of Ralph Vaughan Williams being included in that, and of course linking back to her coronation in 1953. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and hopefully giving you a chance to walk down the memory lane of your time singing in choirs in Liverpool. Absolutely. And of course, we have sometime in the future to look forward to a coronation, and no doubt Ralph Vaughan Williams will be part of that celebration, whenever that may be. So there's something to look forward to as well. And of course, one of the great things about these great events of state is, as in 1953, we have music written for the coronation by Vaughan Williams. For Her Majesty's funeral, we have music by Judith Weir and Sir James Macmillan. So it'll be interesting to see who is asked to write something for King Charles III's coronation. Something to look forward to. And in 100 years, people can be talking about that as a great historical orchestral piece. Yeah. Richard Hyde is the British Consul General in Houston. Richard, thank you very much. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who supports Behind the Music and the Houston Chamber Choir. I'm St. John Flynn, and this is Behind the Music. Thank you to all who support the Houston Chamber Choir, our season underwriter, Silvercrest Asset Management Group, our patrons, donors, and subscribers. We appreciate all you do to help keep the work of the Houston Chamber Choir possible. I'm St. John Flynn, and this is Behind the Music. Join us again next time.
The Houston Chamber Choirs with One Accord is your one-stop shop for choral joy. If you enjoyed this podcast, help us to continue our mission to grow the esteem and appreciation of choral music by sharing, reviewing, and subscribing to our content. As a 501c3 nonprofit, support from listeners like you allows us to continue to create new and exciting programming. For more information about us and how you can support our work, please visit houstonchamberchoir.org/give.